This is the story of the one. As a custodial supervisor at a high school, he knows that during cold and flu season, germs spread fast. It's why he partners with Grainger to stay fully stocked on the products and supplies he needs, from tissues to disinfectants to floor scrubbers. All so that he can help students, staff, and teachers stay healthy and focused. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
In 1922, author Sam Cowan wrote a biography of a man unknown to the world just a few years earlier. He began his book with these words, quote, "From a cabin back in the mountains of Tennessee, 48 miles from the railroad, a young man went to the World War. He was untutored in the ways of the world. Caught by the enemy in a cove of a hill in the forest of Argonne, he did not run, but sank into the bushes and single-handed fought a battalion of German machine gunners until he made them come down that hill to him with their hands in the air. There were 132 of them, and he marched them, prisoners, into the American lines. Marshal Foch, in decorating him, said, 'What you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe.' His ancestors were cane cutters and Indian fighters. Their lives were rich in the romance of adventure. These were men of strong hate and gentle love. His people have lived in the simplicity of the pioneer. This is not a war story, but the tale of the making of a man. His ancestors were able to leave him but one legacy, an idea of American manhood," end quote. In February of this year, I had the opportunity to travel to France for the first time, where I was there to explore the battlefields of World War I for my YouTube channel. I was in Belleau Wood, Champagne, Verdun, and the Somme. Incredible locations with rich history. But out of the many places I visited in my week there, one of the most fascinating was in a valley just outside the tiny French commune of Châtel-Chehery. Châtel-Chehery is, maybe 140 people in it today. You can drive through it in probably 3 minutes. 100 years ago, it really wasn't any bigger. It sits along sloping hills at the edge of the Argonne forest. Visiting there as an American, I couldn't help but notice how much it reminded me of places I visited back home. I was driving down the main street and people waved at me as if I'd lived there all my life. I got out of my car and I walked the sidewalk where every person that I encountered said bonjour with a smile, as if they knew me, as if I belonged. As I walked the trails of the valley outside of town, there were people wearing orange vests hunting in the hills. It was really quite memorable for me because it reminded me so much of towns in central Pennsylvania that I visited or in the hills of eastern Tennessee. But in the fall of 1918, there was nothing familiar about that place. The Argonne Forest was at the center of the largest offensive in the history of the United States military. From September 26th to November 11th, 1.2 million Americans fought in what we know today as the Meuse-Argonne offensive. 26,000 of them were killed. Nearly 100,000 were wounded. That's more Americans killed than in either Operation Overlord or the Battle of the Bulge in the Second World War. A week into the offensive, newspapers back home in America carried the story of a group of men from the 77th Division who were caught behind enemy lines. These men became known as the Lost Battalion. The story of their ordeal unfolded in newspapers across the country, as did the story of their rescue, which took place on October 7th, 1918. The next morning, October 8th, just 2 miles away from where the Lost Battalion was found, another story unfolded. One that didn't make the headlines, at least not right away. It would be months before the exploits of the unlikeliest of heroes would be made known to the world. That unlikely hero's name was Alvin York. Alvin York was born on December 13th, 1887 in a one-room log house in the Wolf River Valley of Fentress County, Tennessee, right on the state line with Kentucky. The home where he was born had belonged to his great-great-grandfather, a man named Coonrod Pyle, who first settled that valley in 1800. He was a slave-owning pioneer who supposedly had hunted with Davy Crockett. Alvin's grandfather, Uriah York, stormed the castle at Chapultepec during the Mexican-American War alongside men like Lee, Grant, Jackson, and Longstreet. After the Civil War broke out in 1861, Uriah fought with the 1st Tennessee Infantry of the Union Army. Alvin was the third son in a poor family of 11 children. His father, William, was a farmer and a blacksmith, and the children had very little education because they were expected as early as possible to work the family farm. In his biography of Alvin York, Sam Cowan wrote this about York's upbringing. He said, Alvin was born in a one-room cabin in December of 1887. There were 2 older children, Henry and Joe. Alvin's early life was different in no way from that of other children of the mountains. He lived in touch with nature, and without ever knowing when or how the information came to him, he could call the birds by their names, and he knew the nests and eggs of each one of them, knew the trees by their leaves and their bark, and was familiar with the haunts of the rabbit and the squirrel, the land and the water turtle. While still too small for the rough run of the mountains, he has stood red-eyed by the gate of his home and watched his father and the hounds go off to the hunt. And as he grew, his hair took on that color. There was one part of the routine of the week that has interested Alvin York from early boyhood. It was the shooting matches, held on Saturday, on the mountainside above the spring, just where a swell of the slope made a tableland, and where a space had been cleared for these tests of skill. The clearing was long and slender. 150 yards were needed for one of the contests. This aisle had been cut through a forest of gray beech and brown oaks. At the points where the targets were to be set, the clearing widened so that the sunlight filtering through the leaves and flickering upon the slender carpet of green could fall full and clear. Each Saturday the mountaineers were there, and William York and Alvin were among the regulars. Often there were 50 or more men, and they came bringing their long rifles, horns of powder, pouches made of skin in which there were lead and bullet molds, cups of caps, cotton gun wadding, carrying turkeys, driving beeves and sheep, which were to be the prizes. And when the prizes gave out, some of the men remained and shot for money. The turkey shoots were over 2 ranges, one 40 yards and one 150 yards. At the latter range, the turkey was tied to a stake driven in the center of the opening at the further end of the glade. A cord about 2 feet in length was fastened to the stake and to one leg of the gobbling, moving target. It was 10 cents a shot, tossed to the man who offered the prize. Often the bird fell at the first trial, and a hit was any strike above the turkey's knee. But the long-distance turkey shoots were the opening events, and the marksman had his gun to warm up, his eyes to test, and his shooting nerve to be brought to calmness. So frequently it would happen that the entrance money ran into a sum that gave a prize value to the turkey, as prices ran for turkeys in those days. There was the element of chance for the man offering the prize that was always alluring. The second turkey shoot was held at the 40-yard range, but the bird was now tethered behind a log, so that only his head and red wattles could appear. Here, too, the turkey was given freedom of motion and granted self-determination as to how he should turn his head and wonder at the assemblage of the men before him. Or, if he should elect, he could disappear entirely behind the log if he found something that interested him upon the ground nearby. And the marksman must wait for the untimed appearance of the bobbing head. It took prompt action and a quick bead to score a hit. And it was years afterward, after Alvin York had become the most expert rifle shot that those mountains have ever held, that he sat in the brush on the slope of a hill in the forest of Argonne and watched for German helmets and German heads to bob above their pits around the trees, just 40 yards away. I'm 44 years old now, and while I recognize that to those of you who have much more experience in life, that probably still sounds fairly young. It's the place in life where you're far enough along that you can really start to look back on things that happened in your younger years and see how they prepared you, how they molded you to be the person you are today, for good or for bad. And as I read the story of Alvin York as told by this author, Sam Cowan, I can really see how these events of his youth prepared him for, I think, what we would all agree was the defining moment of his life. Of course, he didn't know it at the time, just as we don't know it when things are happening to us. At the time, we think that they're boring or that they're meaningless or that they have no value, but it's sometimes only years or even decades later that we can look back and realize that those things that we once downplayed or despised in our lives made us who we are. That was true for this young man. These turkey shoots, they may have been fun. They may have been something he looked forward to the way that we look forward to the weekend. But for Alvin York, they were preparing him for the defining moment of his life. Another defining moment came in 1911 when William York, Alvin's father, passed away. By this point in Alvin's life, his two older brothers were out of the house, and so it fell to Alvin to help raise the family, raise his younger siblings. To supplement the family's income, he went to work in a railroad, in construction, and then also as a logger. By all accounts, he was not only a skilled laborer who was devoted to the welfare of his family, he was also a violent alcoholic, prone to fighting in saloons. Historian Dr. Michael Birdwell wrote, quote, "As York became of age, he earned a reputation as a deadly accurate shot and a hellraiser, drinking and gambling in borderline bars known as the Blind Tigers. York was generally considered a nuisance and someone who would never amount to anything. That reputation underwent a serious overhaul when York experienced a religious conversion in 1914. In that year, two significant events occurred. His best friend, Everett Delk, was killed in a bar fight in Static, Kentucky, and he attended a revival conducted by H. Russell of the Church of Christ in Christian Union. Delk's senseless death convinced York that he needed to change his ways or suffer a fate similar to his fallen comrade, which prompted him to attend the prayer meeting." End quote. This was a crisis of conscience moment in Alvin York's life. We all face these at some point where everything we thought we knew, everything that has defined our life to that moment runs up against something that gives us an opportunity to radically change direction or double down on who we already are. And for Alvin York, this moment was a radical change in direction. He knew something needed to change. And there are a lot of different ways that can go when you realize that something needs to change in your life. For him, it meant becoming committed to his new faith. Now, this was not just some ordinary Christian sect. This was a very small denomination that had a devoted following, but mainly just in the states of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. It was also a denomination that had a very strict moral code which forbade things like drinking, dancing, going to the movies, swimming, popular literature, and violence and war. So for Alvin, this was not simply giving up drinking and getting in bar fights. This was a radical change in everything that he believed in. And that change was about to be challenged in a pretty significant way. because 1914 was also the year that the Great War broke out in Europe. We know it today as World War I, but at the time it was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars. You name the description, and it was given. It was violent, it was destructive, and it was unlike anything that the Western world had ever seen before. By 1917, the war had raged for nearly 3 years. And there were millions dead, many millions more wounded, scarred for life, mentally and physically. It was in 1917 that the United States of America finally entered the war against the Central Powers led by the Germans. In his war message on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson pledged our nation's considerable resources to help the Allies defeat the Central Powers. But what the Allies desperately needed more than anything were fresh troops to relieve the men who had been on the Western Front for going on 3 years. Now, the problem was that the United States of America did not have much of an army at that point, despite the fact that throughout 1916, Wilson had begun the process of improving the Americans' military preparedness. At the time of the declaration of war in April of 1917, the United States only had about a 100,000-man army, and that was nowhere near what was going to be needed to fight in Europe. So to deal with that shortage of manpower, President Wilson encouraged the government to adopt military conscription, just as had been done for most of the countries of Europe. He argued that was actually the most democratic form of enlistment. So on May 18th of 1917, the Selective Service Act was signed into law. The act required all men in the United States between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for military service. And within a few months, something in the neighborhood of 10 million men across the country had registered in response to this military draft. One of those men was 29-year-old Alvin York. These draft registration cards are really quite fascinating to read through. And if you're interested at all in your own family history, Ancestry.com has these draft registration cards available. That's where I'm reading Alvin York's right now. And just read you some of the information that he provided for this document. He gives his name as Alvin Cullum York, age 29, home address Pall Mall, Tennessee, gives his date of birth, states that he's a natural-born citizen who was born in Pall Mall, Tennessee. He says that he's presently employed as a laborer on a farm, and that he works on a farm in that same town. He states that he has a mother, brothers, and sisters who are dependent on him for support, that he's single, that he is Caucasian, he has no military service, that he's got blue eyes and red hair, he's not bald, he has no physical defects of any kind. But here is the most fascinating part of this document and the indication of what's to come in Alvin York's life. I've read a lot of these documents over the years, and typically when you read under number 12, it says, "Do you claim exemption from the draft? Specify grounds." Now, I've seen things like people saying that they have an injured knee or they've lost an eye, something along those lines, but I've never seen one that says what Alvin York says in that column. And he puts these words. It says, yes, don't want to fight. And that is the story of Alvin York, a man who was in his youngest days a fighter, who's an expert marksman, who has all of the makings of the perfect American soldier. And yet when given the opportunity to go and fight for his country, he says, no, I don't want to fight. I want to stay here and be a farmer. I want to live at peace. I want to continue down this path that I made a decision to follow just a couple of years ago when my best friend was killed in a bar fight. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the guy who drinks and injures and hurts other people. I just want to live my life at peace. But as we've already been discussing, sometimes there are those moments in our lives where the trajectory of our lives changes forever. Sometimes it's because of our own choices, and sometimes it's things that happen to us and how we respond to those things. Alvin York didn't get a choice on whether or not this war happened. He didn't really even get a choice on whether or not he participated in the war, but he did have a choice in how he responded to these events that happened to him. And it's that response that made Alvin York a legend. That initial claim for conscientious objector status by Alvin York was denied. He appealed the decision, citing his religious faith as a member of a pacifist denomination of Christianity. But here's the thing. During World War I, conscientious objector status did not exempt the objector from military duty. Those individuals could still be drafted. They were just given assignments that wouldn't conflict with their anti-war principles. And so it was in November 1917, just weeks before turning 30 years old. Alvin York was drafted and began his army service at Camp Gordon in Georgia. From the day he registered for the draft until the day he returned from the war in late May of 1919, Alvin York kept a diary. Now, this diary is fascinating to read through because, first of all, it gives us a glimpse into what Alvin York was like on a day-to-day basis. And it even gives us a glimpse into how he talked. He didn't talk like you and I speak today. My family comes originally from Eastern Kentucky, and so I'm a little bit familiar with the way people spoke at that time, especially coming from the hills of north central Tennessee, as Alvin York did. It's a different way of speaking. It's a different use of words. It's a different way of saying those words. And so it's very much written in Alvin York's way of speaking, but it also shows us that his faith was very, very real in his life. It was not just an act. It was not just something that was on the external. This was how he thought. This is how he interacted with other people. And in his diary, he wrote that he actually refused to sign documents that were provided by his pastor seeking a discharge from the army on religious grounds, and similar documents that were provided by his mother asserting a claim of exemption as the sole support for his family. Despite that initial signed request he had provided earlier for an exemption, it appears that now he rejected the idea of being a conscientious objector. York was assigned to Company G of the 328th Infantry, 82nd Division. We know it today as the 82nd Airborne Division, but at the time, it was just the 82nd Division or the 82nd Infantry Division. Now, despite the fact that he had resigned himself to serving in the military, there was still a deep concern on Alvin York's part and a conflict between his pacifism and this ongoing training to kill his fellow man. And so York decided to speak at length with his company commander, Captain Edward Danforth, and his battalion commander, a man named Major G. Edward Buxton, who was a devout Christian himself. Speaking about these conversations, Sam Cowan wrote, quote, "They explained the conditions under which it were possible, if he chose, to secure an exemption. They pointed out the way he could remain in the service of his country and not be among the combat troops. The sincerity, the earnestness of York impressed the officers, and they had not one but a number of talks in which the scriptures were quoted to show the Savior's teachings. They brought out many facts about the war that the Tennessee mountaineer had not known. York did not take the release that lay within his grasp. Instead, he thumbed his Bible in search of passages that justified the use of force. One day before the regiment sailed for France, when York's company was leaving the drill field, Captain Danforth sent for him. Together they went over many passages of the Bible which both had found. In one, he quoted, "If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight." Then they were together for several hours. At last York said, "All right, I'm satisfied." After that, there was no reference to religious objection. From the first, he had seen the justice of the war. Now, he saw the righteousness of it. York's abilities as a soldier were soon revealed. He quickly qualified as a sharpshooter, both as skirmisher and from the top of the trench. In battalion contest formation, where the soldiers run and fall and fire, shooting at moving targets, it was not difficult for him to score 8 hits out of 10 shots, and with a rifle that was new to him. This, too, over a range that began at 600 yards and went down to 100 yards, with the targets in the shape of the head and shoulders of a man. In these maneuvers, he attracted the attention of his officers. The impressive figure of the man, with its ever-present evidence of reserve force, the strength of his personality, uneducated as he was, made him a natural leader of the men around him. Officers of the regiment have said that he would have received a promotion while in training camp, but for the policy of not placing in command a man who might be a conscientious objector." End quote. Traveling first to Boston, York's unit sailed for Le Havre, France, in May of 1918 and arrived later that month after a stop in Britain. Here's what Alvin York had to say about his first experiences in France. Quote, "So we got to France at Le Havre. There we turned in our guns and got British guns. Well, we went out from Le Havre to a little inland camp. I had taken a liking to my gun by this time. I had taken it apart and cleaned it enough to learn every piece, and I could almost put it back together with my eyes shut. The Greeks and Italians were improving. They had stayed continuously on the rifle range for a month or two and got so they could shoot well. They were fairly good pals, too. But I missed the Tennesseans. I was the only mountaineer in the platoon. I didn't like the British guns so well. I don't think they were as accurate as our American rifles. My buddies were some boys from the East. There was Corporal Murray Savage. He got killed in the Argonne. And Harry Parsons from Brooklyn, New York. I think he was a vaudeville actor. And there were a lot of other Eastern boys who were in my platoon. It sure was a mixed platoon, with the Greeks and Italians and New York Jews, and there were some Irish and one German. I sure did miss the mountain boys from Tennessee and Kentucky, but I got to like those other boys in my platoon. I was the largest in the platoon. We got our first gas masks in Le Havre. I was still a private. The man in charge of my platoon was Lieutenant Stewart from Georgia. The company commander was Captain Danforth of Augusta, Georgia. Our platoon sergeants were Sergeant Early and Sergeant Harry Parsons. Early was busted for being AWOL after we left Le Havre. After that, he was acting corporal. He was a good soldier. Parsons was never busted. He was a good soldier, too. I was made a corporal just before we went into the Saint-Mihiel drive. That offensive to which he's referring there, the Saint-Mihiel offensive, was a major battle fought by American and French troops under the command of General Pershing against German positions in the middle of September of 1918. It was the first use by Americans of the terms D-Day and H-Hour. And it was part of a plan by Pershing to break through the German lines and capture the fortified city of Metz. It was the first large-scale offensive that was launched mainly by the U.S. Army, and it caught the Germans in the process of retreating. But it didn't quite work out the way that the Americans had hoped. It did, however, lead to the larger offensive to come at Meuse-Argonne. With the conclusion of fighting in Saint-Mihiel, the 82nd Division was shifted northward to take part in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Entering the fighting on October 7th to relieve units of the 28th Infantry Division, Alvin York's unit received orders that night to advance the next morning to take Hill 223 and then press on to sever the Decauville Railroad north of Châtel-Chehery. Now, you might be wondering, you probably hear that every so often, a name like Hill 223 or at the Battle of Belleau Wood, there was Hill 142. Where did they come up with those names? Well, it's a lot less interesting than you might think. If you look at a map, an elevation map, you'll see that number 223 on Hill 223, and that just indicates that's how many meters high it was in elevation. So it's really a pretty unremarkable name for what was already on the map. So York's unit advanced around 6 a.m. on October 8th to take Hill 223, and they were immediately successful in driving the Germans off of the hill and taking the position. Moving forward from the hill, York's unit was forced to attack through a triangular valley and quickly came under German machine gun fire from several sides from the adjacent hills. And, when you visit there today and you come up over the hill out of Châtel-Chehery, you see this valley just kind of open up. It's so fascinating because you're in this town and there's this main road that drives through the town. And then you get to the edge of the town and you find a place to park and you walk up and over this hill, and immediately it's like you're in a different world. You've gone from civilization to the backwoods. It's the best way to describe it. And you can visualize so easily why this was such a powerful position for the Germans and why it was such a difficult place to be if you're the Americans. Because, they took the initial hill, but now you've got these other hills and you're down in this valley and you've got these dozens of machine gun positions that are just all able to focus their fire from multiple sides down on you. It was no wonder that the Americans were pinned down in this location. The American attack stalled in the valley, and they began to take significant casualties. In an effort to eliminate the machine guns and get the men moving again, a 17-man patrol was set up, led by Sergeant Early, and that included Alvin York. And they were ordered to work around into the German rear. Taking advantage of the brush and the hilly nature of the terrain, the troops were able to slip behind the German lines and advance up one of the hills opposite of the American advance. In the process of doing this, they overran and captured a German headquarters area and secured a large number of prisoners, which included a German major. And this will become important later on in the story. While Early's men began to secure the prisoners, the German machine gunners up the slope turned several of their guns and opened fire on the American patrol. 6 of the 17 were killed. 3 more were wounded, including Sergeant Early. This left Alvin York in command of the remaining group of men. With his men behind cover, guarding the prisoners, Alvin York moved to deal with the machine guns. He wrote later in his journal about what happened, and this is what he said, quote, "The Germans got us, and they got us right smart. They just stopped us dead in our tracks. Their machine guns were up there on the heights overlooking us and well hidden, and we couldn't tell for certain where the terrible heavy fire was coming from. And I'm telling you, they were shooting straight. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home. Our attack just faded out. And there we were, lying down about halfway across the valley, and those German machine guns and big shells getting us hard. Those machine guns were spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth. All around me, something awful. And the Germans were yelling orders. You never heard such a racket in all your life. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into the brush. As soon as the machine guns opened fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. There were over 30 of them in continuous action, and all I could do was touch the Germans off just as fast as I could. I was sharpshooting. All the time I kept yelling at them to come down. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to. But it was they or I, and I was giving them the best I had." What follows next is one of those moments that if it were written as a script for a Hollywood movie, it would be dismissed as too hard to believe, too ridiculous for audiences to accept it. Of course, it did eventually become a Hollywood movie, but it was very, very real. It's right up there with moments like Desmond Doss on Hacksaw Ridge. These moments that just, you can't even wrap your mind around them being true. The idea that one American from the backwoods of Tennessee who a year earlier didn't even want to fight and said so on official government documents would now take on a battalion of Germans by himself with multiple machine guns and not only win, but end up taking over 100 of them prisoner. It's just too far-fetched to believe if it weren't for the fact that people saw it happen. So beginning in a prone position, Alvin York used those shooting skills that he had honed as a boy back home in Tennessee. Picking off the German gunners, he was able to move to a standing position as he continued to evade the enemy fire. At some point during the course of the fight, 6 German soldiers emerged from their trenches and charged at Alvin York with their bayonets. Running low on rifle ammunition, he drew his pistol and he dropped all 6 before they reached him. He then switched back to his rifle and he returned to sniping at the German machine guns. By this point, he believed he had killed somewhere around 20 of the Germans. And not wishing to kill any more than was necessary, he began to call for them to surrender to him. It's one of those things, you see in the movies where, a person or a group are in a very disadvantageous position and their surrender is demanded and they jokingly say, well, if you want to surrender, go ahead. I think of the movie version of The Alamo with Billy Bob Thornton playing Davy Crockett, that man who had supposedly been a hunting partner of Alvin York's great-great-grandfather. And there's the scene where he's the lone survivor of the Alamo and he's on his knees and the officer is translating for him. And Davy Crockett jokingly demands the surrender of General Santa Anna. That's pretty much what's happening here. Alvin York is calling for this German battalion to surrender to him. The crazy part is it works. When he was asked about it later, York said that he was protected by a higher power, by God, who wouldn't allow him to be injured during this fight. And it's not difficult to believe that was true. At one point during the fight, Imperial German Army First Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer, who was commanding the battalion facing Alvin York, actually pulled out his pistol and pointed it at York and emptied the entire thing in trying to kill Alvin York, but didn't even manage to hit him once. After he failed to injure him, and with the help of the major down the hill who had previously been captured, York was able to get the remaining members of the battalion to surrender. Rounding up the prisoners in the immediate area, York and his men had captured an additional 100 Germans. Eventually, they were able to return to battalion headquarters back in the town of Châtel-Chehery while marching their prisoners through artillery and continued rifle fire. When they returned to the headquarters, York reported to his brigade commander, Brigadier General Julian Robert Lindsay, who remarked, "Well, York, I've heard that you captured the whole German army." To which York replied, "No, sir. I only got 132 of them." Now, what's remarkable about the aftermath of this story is that, there was no celebration. There was no party for York and the remaining men to honor what had been done. They were in the middle of a mission. And that mission, once they silenced those guns, continued. They reported back to their battalion, and they continued on to take the Decauville Railroad, which they were able to then subsequently take because of the actions of Alvin York and the remaining members of that 17-man patrol. For his achievements, Alvin York was promoted to sergeant and initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. This was eventually investigated further, and as it went up the chain of command, the award was eventually upgraded to the Medal of Honor in 1919. The award was presented to Alvin York by Commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, General John Pershing. In addition to the Medal of Honor, York received the French Croix de Guerre and Legion of Honor, as well as the Italian Croce al Merito de Guerra. When he was given the French decoration by Marshal Foch, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the Supreme Allied Commander said, "What you did was the greatest thing ever accomplished by any soldier, by any of the armies of Europe." In attempting to explain his actions during the 1919 investigation that resulted in his Medal of Honor, York told General Lindsay, quote, "A higher power than man guided and watched over me and told me what to do," end quote. Lindsay replied, "York, you're right." Now, initially, Alvin York's exploits attracted very little public attention. But on April 26, 1919, Saturday Evening Post correspondent George Patullo published an account of the firefight, and that made Alvin York a hero overnight. His explanation that God had been with him during the fight meshed neatly with the popular attitude that American involvement in the Great War was some sort of crusade. And he returned to the United States that spring to a ticker tape parade, as well as numerous requests for interviews and opportunities to recount his story. Now, it should be noted that Alvin York's story wasn't completely without controversy. At least two of the men in York's unit disputed the official version of the events, though many others confirmed the official version. And there was debate about whether or not the other men in York's command should also be recognized for their valor, and eventually a few of them were recognized with medals of their own. And while York may not have achieved victory over the Germans single-handedly, it's clear that the accounts of his heroism are valid and remain a remarkable achievement worthy of the accolades that he was given. There were a lot of reasons why Alvin York's story became so popular with Americans, but biographer David Lee, I think, hit it pretty well when he described the reasons for Alvin York's popularity. He said York's Appalachian heritage was central to his popularity because the media portrayed him as the archetypical mountain man. At a time of domestic upheaval and international uncertainty, York's pioneer-like skill with a rifle, his homespun manner, and his fundamentalist piety endeared him to millions of Americans as a, quote, contemporary ancestor, fresh from the backwoods of the southern mountains. As such, he seemed to affirm that the traditional virtues of the agrarian United States still had meaning in the new era. York represented not what Americans were, but what they wanted to think they were. He lived in one of the most rural parts of the country when a majority of Americans lived in cities. He rejected riches when the tenor of the nation was crassly commercial. He was pious when secularism was on the rise. For millions of people, York was the incarnation of their romanticized understanding of the nation's past, when men and women supposedly lived plainer, sterner, and more virtuous lives. Ironically, while York endured as a symbol of an older America, he spent most of his adult life working to bring roads, schools, and industrial development to the mountains, changes that were destroying the society he had come to represent. Though he was wooed by filmmakers and advertisers, York just wanted to go home to Tennessee. He married Gracie Williams in June of 1919, and over the next several years, the couple had 10 children together, 8 of whom survived infancy. He was selected as one of several veterans who served as pallbearers for the unknown soldier at the funeral in Arlington in 1921. He also took part in several speaking tours and worked to improve educational opportunities for children in his native rural Tennessee. Though he possessed some political ambition, they never really amounted to anything. As tensions in Europe began to rise in 1938, Alvin York was asked what he thought should be done about the situation, and in typical Alvin York home in Tennessee fashion, he said, quote, "Hitler and Mussolini just need a good whooping, and it looks like Uncle Sam's gonna have to do it," end quote. And that phrase was widely quoted in the nation's press. As I mentioned, he was asked over and over again if he wouldn't tell his story, and he did tell his story to author Sam Cowan in the book that I've quoted several times today. But in 1941, he finally relented and allowed a film to be made about his life. And there were several reasons why he did that. Mainly, he was motivated by a desire to improve things in his hometown. He wanted to build a school, a Bible school, where the people of rural Tennessee could get a good education. And he was able to eventually do that with the money he made from the movie. And that school still exists today. As the conflict in Europe increased in intensity, what initially was planned as a movie about his work to educate children in Tennessee instead became an overt statement for intervention in World War II. The movie, which was known by the name Sergeant York, starred Gary Cooper, who would win an Academy Award for his portrayal. It proved to be a box office hit. In fact, it was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, and it became the #1 box office hit at theaters in 1941. As for his views on the Second World War, Alvin York wanted to fight again. Shows how far he had come from those early days of debating whether or not it was okay to fight. He was rejected on account of his weight and his health and his age, but he did serve as the colonel of the 7th Regiment of the Tennessee Guard, and he became the spokesperson for the Fight for Freedom Committee, which was a counter to Charles Lindbergh's isolationist America First Committee. Unable to serve in combat, he instead was able to play a role in war bond and inspection tours. In the years after the victory in World War II, York advocated for the use of the atomic bomb as a first strike weapon against the Soviets if needed, and in fact was disappointed that United Nations forces didn't use the bomb in their war in Korea. In his last years, he was plagued by financial and health problems, and he passed away in Nashville, Tennessee in 1964. His funeral was attended by numerous dignitaries, including General Matthew Ridgway, who attended as a representative of President Lyndon Johnson. Among his many commands, Matthew Ridgway led the 82nd Division during World War II. The same 82nd Division made famous by men like Alvin York.